All right, so we can get started now. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight for our talk on the importance of green spaces for your mental health. My name is Laura Kasney. I will be hosting the event tonight. I am a conservation director serving Southeast Nebraska for the AmeriCorps Common Ground program. The Common Ground program holds educational webinars and events about conservation issues such as water quality, clean energy, and soil health. We focus on educating the public and preserving Nebraska's natural legacy. A couple items before we start. This is a webinar-based Zoom meeting, so we can't actually see or hear any of you. So if you have any questions during the presentation, please type those in the Q&A option below. During that time, and then at the end of the presentation, we'll have a question section for our speakers. During that time, a poll will pop up on your screen that we ask you to please fill out. It's very important for our outreach, and it's used for grant reporting purposes, so we can continue doing events like these. Also, this event is being recorded and will be put up on the Conservation Nebraska website in the next few days. Today, we are joined by Dr. Julia Torquati and Dr. Ann Schutte from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Dr. Torquati received her master's and doctorate in family studies and psychology from the University of Arizona. Dr. Schutte received her master's in psychology from Concordia University in Illinois and her doctorate in developmental psychology from the University of Iowa. They have worked together on studies regarding nature's effects on cognition, especially in children and adolescents. They conduct research on the influence of natural environments on children's development with current focus on young children's environmental moral reasoning and socio-moral reasoning. So, Anne, I believe you were going first, correct? So we are good to go. Let me just share my screen.
All right, thanks for coming, everyone. So we're going to talk today, like Laura said, about the importance of green spaces for psychological wellness and mental health. So in the past, 50 years or so, the world's population has moved largely into urban areas. So across the world, it's estimated that 55%, so a majority of the population, live in urban areas. In North America, it's even more, estimated at 82% in urban areas. And you might think that, well, Nebraska, we're pretty rural, and we're probably much lower than that. But actually, Nebraska, it's 73% as of the 2010 census. And when the results from the next census become available, my guess is it's even larger now. So majority of the population live in urban areas. And that has implications for well-being. So one question that many researchers have began to ask is, are urban areas detrimental to well-being? And so one way to look at this is to look at there are higher incidence of problems in urban areas. And just to list a few findings, it's estimated that the rate of psychiatric disorders is 30% higher in urban areas, specifically for mood disorders, so things like depression. There are also higher rates of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and autism in urban areas. And there are higher rates of exposure to traumatic events, and as a result, higher rates of PTSD. So there are higher rates of certain problems in urban areas compared to rural areas, but that doesn't really tell us why. So there's lots of reasons why there might be differences between urban and rural areas. In our research, we specifically look at green space and lack of green space in urban areas. And before we kind of get into that, I want to talk a little bit, or I want to do a little thought exercise where I want you to think about, you're going to get lunch, and you have a couple of choices for routes you can walk to go to the restaurant, to your favorite restaurant. One is through more kind of green area, more trees, grass, maybe bushes, other plants, maybe flowers. And then one that is just a kind of downtown sidewalk with maybe a few trees, but not very many. Well, which one would you choose? Well, most people will choose the one with more green. And after spending time in green space, people report feeling happier. They report feeling less stressed, being in a better mood. Whereas walking in a downtown area doesn't have the same effect. Now, physical activity does have some positive effects, but even when you control for that, green space has more positive effects. So there does seem to be something about green space in cities that may be important. So studies that have looked at whether nature, green space influence well-being have found the answer to that is yes, in many different ways. So here is just a partial list of some of the things that green space has been found to influence. So many different areas of mental health, which is one of the things we're going to talk about today. People, for example, report feeling less stressed after spending time in green space. But it isn't just how people feel or their perception of it, but actual physiological measures of stress can reduce after spending time in green space. Even things like, improved body image have been found. Children who spend more time in green space tend to have fewer behavioral problems. It increases pro-social behavior. Communities that have more green space report more social cohesion and feeling more supported. It increases physical activity, improves immune function. People report fewer allergies. Some find lower obesity rates, which may be related to the increased physical activity. But what we're going to focus on today is more the mental health, cognition, which I'm going to talk about next, and self-regulation. So I'm going to talk about how spending time in nature influences our cognition, influences how we think and how well we think. I'm going to talk a little bit about urban green space and its distribution in urban areas, and then aspects of green space that may influence our psychological well-being, our cognition, and mental health. A bit about nature exposure and psychological well-being. And then Julia is going to talk about self-regulation as well as environmental moral reasoning by children. All right, so let's talk a little bit about cognition. So attention restoration theory is a primary theory that talks about how time in nature influences our cognition. So this theory focuses on attention. And according to this theory, we have two attention systems. One is directed attention or controlled attention, or some call it top-down attention. So this is attention that you have to control, that you have a goal. Maybe it is getting a report done at work or reading a book, and you direct your attention towards your goal, and you are controlling your attention, and you are blocking out distractors. The second system is been called fascination or bottom-up attention. And this is a system where the environment basically kind of controls your attention. You don't have to really work to focus your attention. And this little girl here is a great example. So she is playing in the dirt, and she's not having to really work to control her attention and stay focused on what she's doing. She's just fascinated by it. And I don't think you can hear it, but if you could hear the video, you'd hear at one point an airplane goes overhead and she just completely ignores it, right? and she doesn't have to work to ignore it. She's just so fascinated by what she's doing. So according to attention restoration theory, natural environments, they lead to fascination. They let our directed attention rest so that it can have rest, rejuvenate, so that then when we go back to having to use directed attention, we can do better with it. All right. So one of the studies that looked at this in kids looked at kids with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And what Taylor and Quo did was they took kids for a walk, and the walk could either be downtown, in a suburban neighborhood, or in a park. And these are all kids, like I said, diagnosed with ADHD, but they were not on medication for these walks. And then after them, these walks, they did an attention task. Actually, they did the digit span backwards, which is both kind of a measure of memory and attention. And what they found is that when they went for a walk downtown or just in a suburban neighborhood, there was no difference in their scores. But after the walk in the park, look at the jump in score. So following the walk in the park, they got significantly better. They performed significantly better on the test of attention. And what's even more interesting is that the difference between their performance, in the neighborhood and downtown, and the park, is the same difference or the same amount of improvement or the same effect that you see with many ADHD medications, right? And here they're not medicated, and you see an effect almost as strong as medication. So in one of our kind of first studies of this, we wanted to take kids who did not have ADHD and see if a walk in green space would help them. We also want to do that previous study with school age children, elementary age children. We wanted to also test slightly younger. So we did 4 to 5 year olds and 7 to 8 year olds. And they came to campus and we took them for walks, either through an area on campus in downtown with kind of more buildings, not as much green space, a few trees, but not much. So the two photos on the left are from the downtown walk. Or through green space on campus. And this is on city campus at UNL. If you've ever been there, there is quite a bit of green space. It's very park-like in areas, but it's not like a big park, right? But there's a fair amount of green space. So we took them walking through that. And we used a few different measures. We used an attention measure. We also used the spatial working memory measure, which is basically remembering a location on a computer screen for 10 seconds and seeing how accurately they could remember it. The preschoolers were more accurate on the spatial working memory task following the nature walk or the green space walk than they were following the urban walk. And then on the intention measure, all of the kids did better following the green space walk over the urban walk. So Mark Berman and colleagues in Chicago did a similar task with adults to see if you see these effects in adults as well. And what they found is following a nature walk, they improved on memory and attention tasks. But what was interesting is that they also had them just view scenes of nature or urban scenes presented on a computer screen. And even just looking at photos of nature on a computer screen improved their memory and attention over looking at photos of urban scenes. So you don't necessarily have to be in nature, you have some exposure. Several other studies have looked at schools and have looked at greening schoolyards, or just when differences between kids getting to play in green space versus a more built space. In this particular study, what they did was the kids went out for recess and they either played in a green space, so this kind of field here with some trees, or they played in a kind of a less green space, so this cement kind of slab here. And perhaps not surprisingly, they found an improvement in attention after playing in the green space, but no change in attention. So they didn't necessarily get worse after recess. They just didn't improve. So they did an attention task before they went out for recess, and when they came back in, and you might expect them to do better after recess, but they didn't if they played in this kind of built area, but they did show improvement in the green area. So we're also interested in kind of what's going on in the brain. How is green space having this effect in the brain? So in this study, we had school-aged children, 6 to 11-year-olds, and they actually completed working memory and attention tasks either indoors in a quiet room, a place you might expect kids to do well, or outdoors in kind of a green space on East Campus. And in addition to these tasks, we also had them in an EEG net and measured EEG. So EEG is electrical encephalogram. It measures electrical activity at the scalp. And what we found is that, and here you can see one of the participants in the EEG. This is the outdoor setup on East Campus. And what we found is that kids did better in spatial memory outdoors, which is the same thing we found to preschoolers in the previous study, but in this case, we found it with school-aged kids. The attention tasks, they performed the same indoors and outdoors. But what was really interesting is when we looked at the EEG, analyzed the EEG, the electrical activity suggested that kids were using less cognitive effort outdoors, that they were performing just as well on the task, but it was easier for them. Their brains weren't working as hard outdoors as they were indoors. Also looking at brain development, Dadvin and colleagues did a study where they measured children's sizes of different areas of their brain using MRI. They also got addresses for all the kids, for all the places they lived from the time they were born until the time of the study. And they were in the study when they were 7 to 10 years of age. And so they computed what they called the lifelong greenness exposure by looking at the green space surrounding their homes. And what they found was that the lifelong green exposure was related to the volumes of certain areas of the brain. And so all these areas in yellow are areas where the amount of green space around their homes was related to the volume of these brain areas. So these brain areas showed larger volumes. Interesting, a lot of these areas in prefrontal cortex in particular are areas that are involved in attention and working memory. It's a little hard though to control green space exposure in humans. There's some studies that have been very clever in how they've manipulated green space exposure, but we can't assign kids to live in an area that's more green versus less green. But you can do that to rats. So in this study, Lambert and colleagues had rats that were reared in cages, but either in a cage with a lot of natural elements or in a cage with a lot of built elements or man-made elements. And then they looked at brain size after being raised in these different cages. And interestingly, they found that those raised in a cage with more natural elements actually had bigger brains. So green space and nature exposure seems to be important for cognition as well as other areas of well-being. Unfortunately, not everybody has access to green space. In particular, disadvantaged neighborhoods tend to have less green space. So lower SES neighborhoods or minority neighborhoods have both been found to have less green space. So here is one example of an initiative trying to add green space into neighborhoods. So this is an alleyway in San Francisco where the residents themselves went and greened their alley. Others have used things such as this living wall, where plants are actually planted on the sides of buildings. But really, to add green space in a neighborhood often can be quite expensive. And when it does happen in lower socioeconomic status neighborhoods, often it raises the property values and actually pushes out those who are lower SES, which is too bad. So Wells has proposed that nature, the positive effects of nature may actually be the strongest in disadvantaged neighborhoods. They may benefit the most from having green space and more exposure to green space. So this graph is from one study by Mitchell and Popham, or comes from their data. So along the x-axis is exposure to green space. So group 1, these are the people in neighborhoods with the least green space. Group 5 had the most green space. And in this particular study, it's a health measure. And in particular, in this case, it's a mortality ratio. But what they find is that this income group 2 is this green, and there's not much difference from a little bit of green to more green, and that's the highest SES income group. The lowest income groups, however, is the white bars, and you can see their mortality rate is significantly higher in neighborhoods with less green space than in neighborhoods with more green space. So there's definitely work that needs to be done in making sure there's kind of green space or urban green space available to all different communities. All right, so I'm going to end my part of the talk with talking about the elements of nature that are the most important. So is a desert landscape as effective as a forest? Can we have nature in a small scale? If you have, say, a patio, a small patio, does putting plants and things on your patio make a difference? Well, according to attention restoration theory, it could. So attention restoration theory proposes that in order for an environment to kind of restore our attention, it needs 4 things. It needs 1, sufficient extent, meaning you have to be able to kind of immerse yourself in that environment. So adding 1 potted plant to your office may not be enough to really feel like you're immersed in that environment. But it doesn't have to be a huge space either. It can be a small area. It also requires compatibility. So it has to be compatible with your kind of goals. And then it needs to give you a sense of being away. And so being immersed in the environment is also part of this, where you have to feel like you're getting away from whatever it is that might be stressing you. So if you're at work and you go, leave your office to go sit in a park for lunch, that might give you a sense of being away. And then it has to be fascinating. It has to be something where there isn't a lot of things that are kind of grabbing your attention, but there are things that are interesting. So this girl here, who actually happens to be my daughter, playing in the water, this environment, this was fascinating to her. Right? She was really interested in it. She could spend hours sitting there, just kind of playing in the water, looking at the fish in the water and so on. Other researchers have looked specifically at kind of what are the features of the environment that kind of give you that fascination and that feeling of immersion and so on. And just a few studies that I'll go over, they found that environments with water and blue space can help, and non-veiling vegetation, so vegetation where you can still kind of see things, and then trees. So there's a lot of people who look at tree density and how that is useful. I don't think trees are necessarily needed, but I think trees can really help to give you that feeling of immersion and that sense of being away. So tree density has found to be related to people reporting better health. Now, this is their perception of their health. It's not an actual measure of their health, but how they perceive their health. And putting 10 more trees in a block, Carden and colleagues found people reported a level of health that was comparable to being 7 years younger. People also did report fewer cardiometabolic conditions. So that suggests that it really is helpful. And then in a study that Julie and I were involved in with Brian Barger and other colleagues, we found that there were fewer conduct problems in children with autism when they lived in areas where there were more trees and more green space. Another factor that some studies are suggesting is important, but the research is still somewhat mixed on this, is biodiversity. So the more biodiverse the green space is, the more positive effects it may have. But I said research is still mixed, so we have to wait and see how important biodiversity is for mental health and cognition. All right. Now I will turn it over to Julia.
Okay, did you give up your remote control?
I did.
Okay. Okay, so as Anne mentioned, I'm going to be talking about self-regulation and mental health, and then a little bit about environmental moral reasoning, which I think may be of interest to those of you interested in conservation. Okay, I was just checking to see if I had control. Okay, so the reason that we are really interested in self-regulation is because it's associated with well-being in a number of different ways, and it's connected with mental health and good mental health. And so to start off with the definition, self-regulation is really a holistic concept that involves your thoughts, your feelings, and your behaviors, and coordinating all of those. And so here, to be able to flexibly adapt your behavior, your attention, emotions, and cognitive strategies in constructive ways in response to situational demands. Think about how different situations have different behavioral demands. So for example, expectations for a child's behavior in school is very different than their expectations for their behavior at home on the weekends. And so to be able to inhibit certain behaviors, to be able to modulate negative emotions is very important. And so, for example, the research Anne was just talking about, where children who had autism spectrum disorder had fewer conduct problems when they lived in areas with higher density trees, they were better able to regulate their behavior. And so in many ways, self-regulation is a good marker for mental well-being. So it's a foundation for mental health, and it's a developmental task for children. They're gradually developing their self-regulatory abilities throughout childhood. And there are multiple pathways to self-regulation that we can think about that might involve nature. So for example, The first one that Anne was talking about had to do with cognition. And so if we think about attention restoration or improved working memory, those are some of the ways that you may be able to better control your own behavior, your thoughts, and your emotions. The second is emotional, and that would speak to some of the research that has studied mood. And the third is physiology. So if you are experiencing stress or distress and you have that fight or flight response, recovery is faster in natural areas. And so all three of those pathways can really contribute to children and adults being better able to modulate negative emotions, to improve positive emotions, to be able to think more clearly and problem solve, and to make choices about behavior that is going to be adaptive in any situation. So research that has examined some of these things using similar methodology to what Dr. Schutte was talking about in terms of the presence of neighborhood green space and children's emotional and behavioral resilience, which can be another marker of mental health and well-being. In a study by Flori Maduhas and Joshi, if kids had access to their yard and they also made frequent use of parks and playgrounds, their parents were reporting fewer conduct, peer, and hyperactivity problems. And low-income children who were 3 to 5 years of age in urban neighborhoods with more green space had fewer emotional problems than their peers in less green neighborhoods. And this speaks also to that potential buffering effect that Anne was talking about earlier, that some of the biggest effects may be found for lower income populations. Residential green space, so near where children live. Several studies have found positive associations with social cognition, empathy, and social competence. So being able to see another person's perspective, understand another person's feelings, reduced prevalence and symptoms of ADHD, as well as positive associations with emotion management and expression. So this speaks to that self-regulation development, and that enables children to be very adaptive in their social relationships and in school, for example. And those are important contexts for them to be competent in order to be able to accomplish their developmental tasks, as well as positive associations with behavioral inhibition. So you might be angry and you might want to yell at someone or hit them, but you're able to stop that and make a different choice, a more adaptive choice. So specific to schoolyards, and Anne was talking about some of the research on greening of schoolyards. Some studies have followed kids before and after greening a schoolyard, and so there was a systematic review. And overall, children spent more time in moderate to vigorous physical activity after schoolyard greening. Also a decrease in verbal and physical conflicts, as well as more social support and fewer peer problems among younger children. And so they were getting along better. And think about how natural environments might support that. So if children are feeling less physiological stress, if they have better mood and so forth, they may be able to calm themselves when they otherwise might be getting in a more serious conflict. Better mental well-being after schoolyard greening, and decreases in peer problems and depression. With respect to preschools, some comparison of nature and non-nature preschools in northern Minnesota. The children who were enrolled in nature preschools made significantly greater gains in creative thinking across the school year compared to the children in non-nature preschools. So that was measures that were at the beginning and end of the school year for kids in nature and non-nature preschools. And so thinking about a lot of different contexts: home, where children live, schools. And play is a really important part of children's development. And some of the observational studies have found that kids engage in longer bouts of dramatic play. That's pretend play, which is very cognitively complex on a naturalized versus traditional playground, as well as more creative play in high vegetation versus low vegetation outdoor spaces. So there seems to be some support for creativity there. Another aspect of children's socio-emotional development and well-being really has to do with moral reasoning. So how you get along in the world, and how you get along with others are really important developmental tasks that are related to self-regulation as well. So one question might be, well, what does moral reasoning really mean? What is the domain of moral development? Not every choice is a moral choice. So usually we don't think of our breakfast choice as a moral choice, for example. I suppose you could imagine a situation where that's the case. And so that's really the personal domain. A conventional domain is really more traditions and social routines that help things run smoothly, but those are context and time specific and they can change. So for example, shaking hands was fairly common before the pandemic, not so much during and after the pandemic. That's an example of a conventional choice. Whereas a moral choice is really one that has the potential to harm or help another. And so in that regard, a moral decision has to do with principles that are generalizable. In other words, they apply universally to everyone and in similar situations. And so, for example, no one being above the law. So it's not that it applies only to one person or only in one situation. There are also moral decisions are not dependent upon social rules because rules can be unfair. And so, for example, it's not okay to harm someone, even if there is a rule that says it's okay to harm someone. And the justification for moral decisions are based on rights and welfare of others. And the word welfare here refers to well-being. So this would be the thou shalt nots, as well as the thou shall. So a moral decision is something that's good to do because it may help someone else, or it's something that you don't do because it might hurt someone else. But some people have wondered whether or not that might apply to nature. And there is a body of research that suggests that children do think of nature as having moral rights. And so in terms of development, children understanding welfare is the foundation for understanding justice. Welfare means you understand the well-being of another person, one person. And children understanding justice means that they understand as a group that sometimes the rights of one person might interfere with the rights of another person, and that you have to think about how to negotiate that. So it's moving it to the level of groups and societies. And so in order to reason about justice, you need to know about the context, consequences of various decisions, and the needs and rights of everybody who's involved. And so you can apply that to nature and environmental issues as well as human issues. So a researcher who's done a lot of work in this area is Peter Kahn. And what he found in terms of children's development is that young children really emphasize welfare. So does this action harm another person? And older children tend to emphasize justice. So how does this apply to everyone? And so justice really builds on the concept of welfare. Harm to one, harm to many. What does that really mean? And so the method that we use to assess this was developed by Peter Kahn, and he uses a vignette. So let's say there's a person who threw trash in the lake. Would that be okay or not okay? And then there are important follow-up questions because you can say yes or no, but you want to know the justification. So would throwing trash in a lake affect the fish? Would it affect birds, water, or people who visit the lake or live nearby? And if children say, yes, it would harm, then you ask, would you care and why would you care? And we're very interested in their justifications. Now, to get to the real generalizability, does this transcend this particular location? What if there was a city that was far away and there was a rule that was okay to throw trash in the lake? Then would it be okay or not okay? And so in that case, it's not contingent upon rules because it might not be okay, even if there's a rule that allows it. So what Peter Kahn has found, and in this particular study, he studied first, third, and fifth graders, but he actually has studied up to young adulthood, is that the vast majority of kids say no, it's not okay. And it's not okay even in a far off place where people thought it was okay or where there's a rule that allows it. And they're primarily focusing on moral justifications. So harm to another person or justice or a particular value. So no one had studied preschool age children. And so that was the goal of the study I'm going to be telling you about now. that I've done with some of my colleagues. So we want to know if preschool age children also judged environmentally harmful actions in the same way: wrong, prescriptive, generalizable, and not contingent on rules or social conventions. How do preschool children justify their judgments? And we want to know, in terms of their direct experience with nature, what is the influence of the direct experience they have in school and out of school? And so at home, we wanted to know about the amount of time they spend outdoors and the kinds of environments where they spend their time, as well as the socialization piece. So how important it is to their parents that they spend time outdoors. And then finally, do children attending a nature focused preschool differ from children attending non-nature focused preschool in their judgments or justifications? So this is a sample of 146 kids and their parents in preschools from 7 programs in 3 different states. So it was a pretty broad sample. And then we also had a nature and non-nature preschool. So we had one nature preschool and with 53 children who participated and 97 kids from non-nature preschool programs. And we did the conservation interview. We asked children about a lake nearby, and if they had not experienced that, we asked them if they'd ever been to any lake, because some children had been to lakes with their grandparents or their parents. We transcribed their interviews and we adapted the coding system, and 2 people coded their interviews and resolved their differences through consensus. So this is just an example of some of the codes. Why would you care, for example, if fish were harmed when you threw trash in the water? So concern about welfare really had to do with fish getting sick or die, not wanting birds to get hurt, and the earth being sad. Anthropocentric or human-centered reasons: I couldn't go swimming. That would be stinky and I wouldn't like it if there was trash in the water. You might get in trouble. Trees are our breathing buddies, so that's really the human-focused reason. But biocentric, some of the kids actually came up with biocentric reasons, which are that nature has value beyond what humans can derive from that. So because then the flowers won't grow, and the value is grow. So growth being part of nature. The food chain will break and plants might have food for animals. So that doesn't have anything to do with humans. And then social convention: you're not supposed to, it's a rule. Your mom or your teacher said so, or you're supposed to put it in the trash can. So kids have these very different, but falling into these different categories, reasons for why they would care if fish, water, birds, or people were harmed. So what did we find? Well, like with the older children, we found that the proportion of kids who said it was not okay to throw trash in a lake was quite high. So overall, for one person to throw trash in the lake, almost 90% of kids said no, that's not okay. For everyone to throw trash in the lake, it was 92%. And what about that other city where there's a rule that says it's okay? Well, it went down a little bit to 78%. And in terms of their justifications or their reasons, in terms of their reasons, harm to nature was the most frequent category for all 3 situations. Biocentric reasoning was fairly rare in this age group of kids, which is not surprising. Even in Peter Kahn's studies of elementary age kids, it was more around 4 or 5%. And human-centered reasons were also fairly common, but that the fact that kids had this understanding of harm to nature, and that was in part driving their decision making, is important. So our second question of interest is really, so what kinds of things about children's knowledge about nature might influence their environmental moral reasoning? And so to look at these correlations, children made judgments of the importance of different aspects of nature, and that was correlated with their knowledge of nature. So the more you know, the more you think nature is important. The more knowledge they had about nature, the greater was their environmental moral reasoning. And the greater variety of natural contexts that they had access to was also associated with their environmental moral reasoning. And here, so the variety, the frequency of access to nature, so this big circle here, was correlated with the amount of time that they spent outdoors on school days, on non-school days, and the variety of spaces that they spent time in. So woods, streams, fields, that sort of thing. And then the extent to which parents rated children's experiences in nature as important, as a way to think about parents as really sort of facilitators or gatekeepers, regulators of preschool age children's experiences, is really important. Um, so we put all these variables together in an equation, and the two things that really stood out were children's knowledge of nature and their access to a variety of types of natural spaces that were predicting their environmental moral reasoning. So if we go back to this question of justification, we see just a similar pattern across all of the different scenarios where children's concern about harm to nature was a driving force. But when we compare nature and non-nature preschools, one of the things that you see here is that kids in the nature preschools had a much more complex and nuanced understanding of how trash might hurt fish, birds, people, and water. They would have an understanding that fish might eat it and get sick and die. Whereas some other kids would think that trash might be good for the fish because it gave them something to eat, for example. And so if you think that it's not harmful, then it doesn't even become a moral question. However, if you look at the non-nature preschool, there was a much greater proportion of rule-oriented reasons, because you might get in trouble because you're not supposed to. So they were much more oriented towards social convention rather than this moral rationale that it might harm the animals. Is it okay for everyone to throw trash in the lake? Again, a majority of kids, over 90%, said no. And when asked why not, you similarly have this high proportion of kids talking about harm to nature. But again, in the non-nature preschool, you see a much more reliance on social convention as a rationale. And similar findings, this faraway city with a rule, similar proportions for kids in nature and non-nature preschools, citing harm to nature as their reason, but social convention still higher in the non-nature preschool. So they were much more likely to report that. We only saw, this was a spontaneous finding, so we only found an action orientation in the nature preschool. So when asked the question about throwing trash in the lake, sometimes the kids got really passionate in their responses, and these are just a couple of examples. I would put those things over your eyes that help you see under the water and get all of the trash out. And then another child who said, because if I was in that land, I would just change the rules in response to the question about the faraway land where it was allowed. Now, I want to talk a little bit here about funds of knowledge and the importance of children's experience and knowledge about nature and how that influences their environmental moral reasoning. Because in order to reason about justice, you need knowledge about the context and the consequences of your actions. So knowledge about nature and environmental issues and knowledge about human issues. So these are some of the examples of things that kids came up with about problems that might hurt nature or the environment. And these are responses from the whole sample, but I'll point out that at the nature preschool, some of these examples were things like invasive species, funguses can infect plants and animals.
What are funguses?
I'll tell you later. And breaking or stepping on plants. So you need to stay on the trail so that you're not breaking or stepping on plants, because that's harming nature. So they understand that. Do you do anything to help or protect nature? And kids in the nature preschool had much better, many more responses, and a variety of responses about things they do. So putting worms back in the soil is a way to help nature, to take garlic mustard out of the ground, which is an invasive species, to grow plants animals might like, and to take care of animals and water plants as examples of the kinds of things, everyday activities. They understand that it's everyday activities. As a preschooler, you don't need to know necessarily about endangered species to be concerned about protecting or taking care of nature. You have to have empathy for roly-polies, for example.
Roly-polies, I love the
Yes.
roly-polies.
And you need to know that if you step off a trail, that your feet might cause erosion or damage plants. So in summary, even preschool age children tend to judge environmentally harmful actions as wrong, as transcending space, as not contingent upon rules or social conventions. And they tend to cite harm and human justifications for their environmental judgments. And children attending non-nature focused preschool more often cited social convention as justification for their judgments. So the implications for children's development, given the research that Anne described, natural environments provide benefits for how children think, especially in terms of attention, working memory, inhibitory control. And that has important implications for self-regulation. And natural environments provide benefits for what children think about nature and how they feel about the well-being of people, plants, animals, and the earth. And that's really important preparation to be a good friend and a good citizen. And I'll leave you with the quote: if a child is to keep alive his inborn sense of wonder, he needs the companionship of at least one adult who can share it, rediscovering with him the joy, excitement, and mystery of the world we live in. And any one of us can be that one adult. I would encourage you to do that. Thank you very much for joining us this evening.
All right, thank you all. And thank you both for speaking today. Sorry, trying to get everything set up. I'm gonna stop sharing real quick. If anybody has any questions, please put it in our Q&A option below. I'm gonna be doing a little poll. It's just gonna pop up on your screen and we'll be all good to go. Your son is very cute.
Thank you.
All right, and for anybody who jumped in kind of late on the presentation today, this is being recorded and it will be put on to the Nebraska Conservation website. It'll just probably happen next week. I'm also going to add in the chat a couple of the papers that they talked about, of their studies that both Julia and Anne did. So if you're interested, it's got the names and then the links, and it's all free to look at online. And you can just look at those. Oh, awesome. So we do have a question. So we have one from Matt. He's asking, within the framework of art, which is capitalized ART, is it supposed that both directed and fascination attention have separate neural correlates? Do they function using the same circuits?
So I don't know if we know the complete answer to that. The assumption is that it's not, there's overlap, but not exactly the same circuits.
And then from Kristen, many of the studies focused on urban environments, but is there any research or can we draw any conclusions on how rural communities and people interact with nature and how to better do this?
So that is a great question. It is something that we've talked a lot about at UNL, Julie and I, as well as others, because of there being so many rural areas. And it is an area that I think is probably understudied. I honestly don't know of any studies that have specifically looked at that question of rural people in how they interact with nature. I will say, however, that Agnes Vandenberg, she's done some work looking at the effects of time in green space and time in nature for people who, it's part of their job. So people who are, I don't know, park rangers and things like that. And they do not necessarily get the same benefits from nature in terms of stress, restoring attention and so on, that people who don't work in nature get, which is probably not surprising. But as far as just differences between rural and urban areas, I don't know of any studies. Do you, Julia?
Well, we assessed where people lived, and we did that in a couple of different ways in the environmental moral reasoning study. And we didn't have very many rural participants, but from what, just sort of minimal analyses we could do with that small sample size, we didn't see any differences. But again, that's just something that we need to look more closely at, I think.
That would be a really good study question. So we don't have any more questions yet, but if anybody does have any more that they would like to ask, now is the time. There we go. Okay, so another from Matt. In your research experience, do you have insights or ideas about what mechanisms are responsible for the benefits we report from nature exposures? He's reminded of Ming Kuo's work to parse out pathways that may work together.
So I actually had in my talk originally the figure of the different pathways by Ming Kuo that I took out for time. So I think there are several pathways like Ming Kuo has proposed. Yeah, I think there's many different mechanisms that potentially have these effects. And I don't think we know enough yet to really know all of the mechanisms and how they interact with each other. Especially if we're talking about developmental effects. So not just kind of short term, for example, attention restoration or stress relief, but if we're looking at how green spaces influence children as they develop, then I think we're definitely talking about multiple pathways. Sorry, Julie, I think I cut you off.
No, I was just going to say, I think they could be working together. And I found the research on the brain, the MRI research on the lifetime green space exposure really provocative. And there aren't very many developmental studies like that. So we need to do more.
Mm-hmm.
We do have another question from Peggy. She's asking, are you familiar with any research that has been done on the impact of green spaces in nature on the progression of dementia?
So I don't know of any specifically on the progression of dementia. There certainly have been some looking at the impact of green spaces on older adults specifically, and have found positive effects on mental health of older adults, but I don't know of any specifically on dementia. I don't know, Julia, have you? Yeah, so I think that's an open question yet, whether or not it has an impact.
Okay. So another one kind of about the aging population. So if you could just go into a little bit more about the older communities and green space exposure. Have there been studies that you're aware of exploring it?
There have. I don't know. Trying to think. I don't know of many well-done studies on cognition, like memory and attention in older adults. Julia, do you?
There have been some health studies.
Yes.
That use, for example, the GIS measures of green space with, much better health outcomes and lower mortality. And so those samples were middle age to later in the lifespan.
And more compost.
But I'm not familiar with any on cognition
Yeah, certainly on health. We do have some pilot data. Unfortunately, we don't have a full sample, but we did collect retrospective reports of green space exposure during childhood and adulthood from young adults or college students, as well as older adults over 65 to 85, I think was the age range. One interesting finding was that the older adults reported much more time outdoors in green space than the younger adults did, which is perhaps not surprising, but unfortunately not a big enough sample to be able to link it to cognitive ability or cognition.
Mhm. We have two more questions. One from Cal is, so tree density has been measured in relation to these developments. Is that accurate? Has there been any research on the different types of plants having more positive impacts than others?
So I don't know of anything looking at specific types of plants other than trees versus not trees, I guess. But like I said, there are some studies that suggest biodiversity, and that's both biodiversity in terms of animals and in terms of plants.
Okay. And then a question from Cindy. I think this is kind of based off of the aging populations question. Is there a link to increased activity, thus decreased chronic health issues? I may have said that one weird.
Well, I think it's getting to, do people engage in more physical activity in green spaces, and thus, I don't know that that path analysis has been done, but there is evidence of both of those things: greater activity, greater moderate to vigorous physical activity in green spaces, as well as fewer chronic health problems. Linking those would be really important.
And then another question from Kristen. She has an example. So if a child is not raised to morally respect nature, does this impact their ability to physically and mentally benefit from it throughout their life? Is moral judgment necessary to enjoy the benefits of nature?
I don't know about the ability to enjoy nature, but I think that the more a child is really understands, so that the moral piece, what harms nature, what helps nature. So understanding that birds, animals, insects, are sentient beings, really lays the foundation for that. And I think that that's really a greater appreciation when you look at, we were, before the talk, you asked the question about birding. If you think about birds as interesting animals that have agency and make their own choices, and it's a lot more fun to watch what they do than if we didn't, if we were thinking of them more like an object, or something that is not deserving of our respect. So while we don't have research evidence to that, I think that that you can think about how taking the perspective of different entities in nature can help you to really have a good appreciation for that.
That was really well put. Anne, do you have an answer, or are we good?
I think that sounds good.
All right. Yeah, that was a really great answer to that one. Okay. And we are a little over time right now, so I don't want to keep you guys too late. So if you guys are all right with ending it, we can just end it here. If anybody else has questions, you can either reach out to Conservation Nebraska, or if Julia and Anne are okay with you finding their information online, you can do that as well, and most likely reach out to them that way. But other than that, we are all good to go. So everybody have a nice night. All right. Bye, guys.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.